It was a quiet night in the suburbs of Woodrest, where the silence was only interrupted by the occasional chirp of a cricket or the whisper of the wind swaying the leaves of the trees. The streetlights cast elongated shadows across the sidewalk, distorting the figures of the few pedestrians still walking through the streets. David Miller walked with a steady stride, his leather briefcase firmly in one hand and his gaze lost in his own thoughts. Not a subscriber yet? Join our community by clicking subscribe and turn on the notification bell to receive alerts for new videos. His impeccable navy blue suit, upright posture, and distinguished demeanor spoke of the authority he wielded in the courtroom, but his mind was too preoccupied reviewing the final details of a high-profile case he was set to face in court. The next day, every step he took was accompanied by the echo of his shoes striking the pavement, a rhythmic sound that helped him organize his ideas, rehearse arguments, and anticipate the defense's strategies. The night breeze carried a fresh, humid air typical of spring in Woodrest. The houses around him remained calm, porch lights glowing and an occasional window illuminated, revealing glimpses of ordinary lives unfolding inside. Families eating dinner in front of the television, children getting ready for bed, the faint murmur of a distant radio. It was a safe neighborhood, the kind of place where people trusted that law and order would prevail. But that tranquility was abruptly shattered. Just as he turned a corner, the flickering glow of red and blue lights illuminated the facades of the buildings. The sound of a short siren, enough to grab attention without being deafening, echoed through the empty street. David stopped immediately, raising his hands slightly in an instinctive gesture to show he posed no threat. He knew how these encounters worked. He had defended too many cases not to understand what was happening. The patrol car screeched to a halt next to him, and after a brief exchange of glances inside the vehicle, the doors opened decisively. Two officers stepped out with firm strides, the crunch of their boots against the sidewalk reverberating in the stillness of the night. "Good evening." Officer Barnes, a robust man in his 40s, spoke in a dry tone, more interrogative than courteous. His expression was hard, with a look of distrust etched onto his face. "What are you doing out here so late?" David turned slowly to face them, maintaining his composure. Calm, poise, firmness. Those were the rules. "I'm on my way home, officer." His tone was polite but not submissive. "Is there a problem?" Barnes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exchanged a glance with his partner, the young officer Grant, who seemed less sure of the situation. Grant didn't have the same rigid jawline or the same coldness in his eyes. It was evident he wasn't entirely comfortable with the power play unfolding. "We got a call about a robbery in the area," Barnes said, his voice monotonous, as if reciting from a worn-out script. "And coincidentally, you match the description." David blinked, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. His tone remained calm, but his jaw tightened. "A robbery?" he asked incredulously. "I just left my office downtown. I'm a lawyer." The silence that followed was heavy. Barnes let out a dry laugh, devoid of humor. "A lawyer, huh?" He repeated the word as if it were a private joke between him and his partner. "So, what's in the briefcase? Stolen goods?" David held back a long exhale. This wasn't the first time he'd been confronted with baseless assumptions. It wasn't the first time his presence in certain places raised unwarranted suspicion. But he knew that losing his patience would only give Barnes an excuse to escalate the situation. "I can assure you, they're legal documents," he said, his voice still steady, though he felt the pressure mounting inside. "You're welcome to inspect them if you'd like." Barnes didn't wait for confirmation. With a brusque motion, he snatched the briefcase from David's hands and began rifling through it without any sort of permission. Help our channel grow, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated on our upcoming content. And we'd love to know, where are you? Watching from? Comment below. David felt a knot of indignation form in his chest as he watched the officer leaf through the perfectly organized papers inside his briefcase. Case notes, classified documents, confidential legal evidence, all violated without the slightest respect. Well, well, Barnes murmured mockingly, raising an eyebrow. Seems like someone's trying a little too hard to prove their innocence. David closed his eyes for a brief moment, forcing himself to suppress the urge to respond with the same sarcasm. This is harassment, officer. His tone hardened, though he still maintained control. I haven't done anything wrong, Barnes frowned. The idea of being challenged didn't seem to sit well with him. That's for us to decide, he replied, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. David felt his patience reach its breaking point. On what grounds are you arresting me? He demanded, his voice firm, though his composure was fraying. You have no evidence. But Barnes didn't need evidence. He never had. Before David could react, he felt the officer's strong hand clamp down on his arm and twist it roughly. A metallic click filled the air as the handcuffs locked around his wrists. Resisting authority for starters, Barnes said, his tone almost amused. Let's see what else we find. Grant hesitated for a moment before reaching for his radio. Dispatch, we have a suspect, he reported quietly, avoiding eye contact with David. As David was pushed toward the back of the patrol car, he felt his heart pounding in his chest. But it wasn't fear that consumed him. It was anger, a controlled, cold, and calculating anger. He wouldn't be another victim. And this, he thought as the patrol car sped off toward the station, wouldn't end here. The air inside the patrol car felt stifling. Through the window, David watched houses and shops blur past as they made their way to the station. The only sound was the hum of the police radio, occasionally interrupted by the casual chatter of the officers in the front seat. Another one off the streets, Barnes remarked with satisfaction, as though they had done the neighborhood a favor. David clenched his jaw, holding back the indignation that churned inside him. He had seen abuses of power before, but this was the first time he was experiencing it firsthand. When they arrived at the station, he was forced out of the car with no semblance of care. His belongings were confiscated and placed into evidence. Bags, each movement carried out with bureaucratic indifference. Carter, book him, Barnes ordered another officer behind the desk. David raised his chin, staring directly at Barnes. I demand to call my lawyer. Barnes smirked mockingly. Well, well, now you need a lawyer. I thought you said you were one. A round of muffled laughter erupted among the officers, but David didn't react. He knew that his best weapon at that moment wasn't anger, but patience. When they led him to the cell, the cold metal bars and the hard concrete bench made his situation feel all the more real. The smell of disinfectant and dampness permeated the air. It was a place designed to break anyone's spirit, but David wasn't easily broken. In the small cell, he reflected on what had happened. The injustice of his arrest wasn't just a personal issue. It was symptomatic of something much larger, a system that allowed law enforcement officers to abuse their authority with impunity. Click subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you'll stay updated on our upcoming videos and won't miss a thing. Minutes turned into hours. Through the bars, David could hear the bustle of the station, phones ringing, murmurs from other detainees, the constant tapping of keys as reports were typed up. And amid those sounds, Barnes's unmistakable voice speaking to another officer. I'm going to pad the report with something solid. Resisting, obstruction. Maybe I'll even add possession of stolen property, Barnes said shamelessly. There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line before Rachel responded in a sharp tone. I'm on my way. David hung up, placing the receiver back in its cradle calmly. The storm had just begun. Time in the cell passed in an oddly slow and tense manner. David maintained a serene posture, but his mind was working at full speed. He knew that every second he spent in that cell without legitimate charges only worsened the situation for the officers who had detained him. Shortly after, the sound of heels echoed down the hallway of the station. Rachel had arrived, David's assistant. A woman with a firm voice and a determined character stormed into the precinct like a force of nature, carrying a folder full of documents under one arm and a recording phone in the other. "I demand to speak with the officer in charge of this station immediately," she declared loudly, drawing the attention of all the officers in the reception area. Barnes turned slowly in his chair, an arrogant smile on his face. "And you are—" Rachel dropped the folder onto the desk with a sharp thud. "Rachel Carter, Chief Assistant to the State Attorney General," she replied without hesitation. "And you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." The station fell silent instantly. A couple of officers, including the young Grant, exchanged uneasy glances. Barnes, however, kept his mocking demeanor. "The Attorney General?" he said with a laugh. "Is that supposed to impress us?" Rachel crossed her arms and stared at him firmly. "Didn't you even bother to check who your prisoner is?" she asked with a dangerously calm tone. "Before you ruin your career with that arrogance, I suggest you call your captain." Barnes scoffed, but just then the door of a back office opened and a tall, grey-haired man stepped into the hallway. "What the hell is going on here?" he asked with a frown. Rachel turned to him with professionalism. "Captain Howard, your station has illegally detained the State Attorney General of Woodrest, David Miller." The captain's reaction was immediate. His eyes widened in disbelief before he turned to Barnes. "Tell me this isn't true." Barnes swallowed hard, his arrogance beginning to crack. We were just following procedure, Captain." The superior's face turned red with fury. "Procedure? Arresting the man who oversees all prosecutors and legal cases in this state without evidence? My God, Barnes, you've just opened us up to a lawsuit." The captain wasted no time. "Get him out of that cell now." Two officers rushed to the back of the station, opening the door so hastily that the hinge squeaked. David stood up with the same calm demeanor he'd had when he entered and walked out of the cell with confident steps. Barnes, pale and tight-lipped, said nothing as David retrieved his watch and briefcase. David turned to the captain. "This matter isn't over, Howard," he said firmly. "But for now, I need an official statement from you about this illegal arrest." Howard nodded nervously. "Of course, Attorney General Miller. This has been a terrible misunderstanding." "No, Captain," David corrected. "This is a perfect example of abuse of power, and I'll make sure there are consequences." As he left the station with Rachel by his side, the cameras of the journalists waiting outside flashed like lightning. What Barnes and Grant didn't know was that tonight's story was about to go national. David adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and prepared for what was to come. It was time to deliver justice. The aftermath. The following days were a whirlwind of calls, meetings, and interviews. The news of the illegal arrest of the State Attorney General had exploded across the media. News programs, social media, and political analysts were passionately debating the case, while public figures and activists demanded a formal investigation into the officers involved. But for David, this wasn't just about a media scandal. It was about justice. His legal team worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, testimonies, and internal records that exposed not just Barnes's abuse of power, but a pattern of misconduct within the Woodrest Police Department. This wasn't the first time Barnes had made unjustified arrests. It wasn't the first time Grant had stayed silent. The difference now was that they had targeted the wrong man. The trial begins. The courtroom was packed on the day of the initial hearing. Reporters crowded the hallways. Activists held signs outside the building, and members of the public came to witness what promised to be a precedent-setting case. In the defendant's seat, Barnes tried to maintain an air of superiority, but his clenched jaw betrayed his nervousness. Grant, seated next to him, looked like a man defeated before the trial had even begun. When the judge took the bench and struck the gavel, the courtroom fell completely silent. The State Court of Woodrest is now in session. Attorney General. David Miller, are you ready to proceed? David rose with the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. Yes, Your Honor. Although the state attorney's office had assigned a lawyer to present the case on his behalf, David insisted on personally handling part of the cross-examination. No one in the room dared to deny him that. The first blow came when they played the patrol car recording. The courtroom screen clearly displayed the moment Barnes stopped David without any cause. The officer's voice echoed through the room with evident mockery as he searched David's briefcase. Look at this, trying to seem more innocent than he is. The footage showed David being handcuffed without justification. Then, back at the station, Barnes' voice was unmistakable as he boasted about getting another one off the streets. The jury and spectators were incredulous. Some murmured among themselves, others simply glared at Barnes with disdain. But David didn't stop. There, he called Captain Howard to the stand. Captain, could you tell us the protocol for arresting a suspect? Howard swallowed hard and straightened his back. There must be probable cause or clear evidence of a crime before proceeding with an arrest. David nodded. Did you receive any evidence that I had committed a crime before arresting me? Howard hesitated. Not that I'm aware of. David turned to the jury. So why was I handcuffed, searched, and held in a cell for hours? The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Barnes glanced at his lawyer with a mix of anger and desperation, but he knew there was no excuse that could save him. The confession, the defining moment, came when Grant was called to the stand. The young officer, visibly uncomfortable, adjusted his tie and avoided eye contact with his former partner. David approached him slowly. Officer Grant, did you order my arrest? No, sir, he replied, his voice barely a whisper. Who did? Grant glanced at Barnes, then lowered his head. Officer Barnes. David waited a moment before asking the next question. Did you believe I had committed a crime when I was handcuffed? The pause was long. Grant closed his eyes briefly before answering. No. A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. David turned to the jury. No further questions. With that single confession, the case was decided. The verdict, the jury's deliberation was swift. In less than 2 hours, they returned with a verdict. The jury finds Officer Barnes guilty of abuse of authority, unlawful detention, and misconduct. As for Grant, due to his cooperation with the investigation and his testimony, the prosecution recommended that he be suspended without pay but allowed to remain in the department under strict supervision. When the judge delivered the sentence, Barnes slumped in his seat, his arrogance finally crumbling. As the officer was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the same humiliation he had inflicted on so many others now fell upon him. David did not smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply felt the satisfaction of knowing that the system, while imperfect, could work when the right tools were used. Upon leaving the courthouse, a crowd awaited him. Journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens wanted a statement. David stopped. On the courthouse steps, facing the cameras. This is not just my case, he said, his voice firm. It's a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. The applause was deafening. David knew this victory was just one battle in a much larger war. But today, at least, justice had prevailed. After the trial, the echo of David Miller's case didn't fade quickly. What had begun as an unjust arrest had become a national symbol of police abuse of power. The story of how the state attorney general had been wrongfully detained and brought his own captors to justice went viral across media outlets and social networks. Want more content like this? Then hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification. A bell, because we always have fresh content and you won't want to miss out. For weeks, interviews and debates dissected every detail of the case. From morning news shows to late-night opinion programs, everyone had something to say about what happened in Woodrest. Civil rights activists used the case as undeniable proof that racial profiling remained a devastating reality in the United States. Some politicians tried to downplay it, arguing it was an isolated incident. But David knew the truth. This was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a systemic problem. Protests that began as small demonstrations in Woodrest grew into massive marches in multiple cities. People demanded police reform, greater transparency, and stricter policies against abuse of power. David, however, wasn't satisfied with merely exposing the problem. He wanted solutions, the reform plan. In the weeks following the trial, David used his platform and position to push for a police reform project in the state. He convened community leaders, criminal justice experts, and government representatives to draft a series of proposals that would change how law enforcement operated. The reform plan included mandatory body cameras for all officers on duty, with severe penalties for those who deactivated them without justification, racial bias and conflict de-escalation training programs, mandatory for all officers and renewed annually, an independent oversight committee composed of citizens, empowered to review complaints of police abuse and recommend sanctions, the elimination of the qualified immunity doctrine, which had shielded many officers from facing consequences for their actions. The proposed changes were not well received by everyone. Police unions immediately opposed the measures, arguing that they weakened law enforcement and put officers at risk while performing their duties. Heated debates erupted in the state legislature, with some officials claiming that such reforms were unnecessary or too radical. The public opinion was on David's side. The people wanted change. This case proved the system needs adjustments, he said in an interview. No one with a badge should feel entitled to act with impunity. We are not against the police. We are against abuse of power. The impact of the case was felt even beyond his state. Other attorneys general and governors across the country began discussing the implementation of similar policies. In Washington, D.C., some senators used the case as an example to push for federal police reforms. An unexpected meeting. A month after the trial, David received an unexpected call. It was Captain Howard, the chief of police in Woodrest. "Mr. Miller," Howard said cautiously, "I was wondering if we could speak in person." David hesitated. He had no reason to trust Howard, but agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, away from the public eye. Howard wasted no time getting to the point. "I'll be honest with you. The Barnes case has shaken the entire department. Some officers see you as a traitor. Others see you as a warning. We're losing the community's trust, and we need to fix this." David crossed his arms. "And why are you telling me this?" Howard sighed. "Because I want to make changes, but I need help. I want your guidance in implementing new policies within the department. I need to regain the people's trust." David studied the man before him. He didn't know if Howard was sincere or simply trying to save his career, but if there was a chance he was willing to change, it was worth trying. "If you're serious," David said finally, "then let's work together. But I won't settle for superficial reforms. If we do this, it has to be real change." Howard nodded. Real change. Thus began an unexpected collaboration. David became an advisor to the Woodrest Police Department, overseeing the implementation of new policies and ensuring they weren't just empty words on a report. He worked with the community to establish direct communication channels between citizens and the police, ensuring that people could file complaints without fear of retaliation. The road wasn't easy. There was resistance. Some officers resigned in protest, but little by little, the culture within the department began to change. The final confrontation. One afternoon, as David walked to his car after a meeting, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Enjoying your victory?" He turned to see Barnes, now dressed in civilian clothes. He had lost his badge, his career, and, it seemed, his arrogance. "I wouldn't call it a victory," David replied calmly. "I'd call it justice." Barnes chuckled bitterly. "I was just doing my job." David held his gaze. "No. Doing your job would have been arresting a real criminal, not inventing charges against an innocent man because he fit your idea of a suspect." For the first time, Barnes seemed to have no response. He looked down and shook his head before stepping back. "I'm leaving town anyway," he said. David watched him for a moment before speaking. "I hope you learned something from all of this." Barnes didn't respond. He simply walked away, disappearing into the crowd. A different future 6 months later, David was at a community event. This time, not as the man who had been unjustly arrested, but as the prosecutor who had brought about real change. He stepped onto the stage and looked at the crowd gathered before him. Among them, he recognized faces of people who had marched for justice, community leaders who had worked alongside him to implement changes, and young people who now saw him as an inspiration. "A few months ago," he began, "I was a victim of the same system I swore to protect. Today, that system is a little fairer, but this isn't about me. It's about every person who has been silenced, ignored, or treated as a suspect simply for existing." The crowd applauded, but David raised a hand to ask for silence. "This is not the end, it's just the beginning." The final applause was deafening. As he stepped off the stage, a young woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for what you've done. My brother was wrongfully arrested last year. Seeing what you've accomplished gives us hope." David smiled and shook her hand. "Hope is the first step toward change. Now it's up to all of us to keep it going." And with that certainty, he knew his fight for justice was only beginning. Did this story inspire you? Leave a like to support the channel and subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapters. And tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from every corner of the world where our channel reaches.